Under the hot lights of television studios, reputations are made and destroyed in seconds. One punchline, one laugh, one perfectly timed jab can shift the way the world sees a person forever. For Meghan Markle, that moment came when Fox News host Greg Gutfeld, known for his razor-sharp wit and no-holds-barred commentary, turned his attention toward her. What should have been just another night of satire for the audience watching at home became a devastating blow for Meghan's image, a reminder that Hollywood, the stage she once longed to command, may no longer be willing to embrace her. But to understand why this moment hit so hard, we have to step back and trace the long, twisting road that brought her here, from her first attempts at fame to her tumultuous journey into royalty and back again. When Meghan first set her sights on Hollywood, she was like countless young hopefuls, full of ambition, armed with persistence, and chasing an elusive dream. She worked her way into small roles, commercials, background appearances. Most people barely noticed her then, and even those who did likely wouldn't have predicted that she'd one day become one of the most polarizing public figures in the world. Her big break on the television drama Suits gave her a measure of recognition, but even that wasn't the kind of stardom she truly wanted. Meghan wasn't looking to simply be another television actress. She wanted to be iconic, the sort of name you whisper with awe. And when she married into the royal family, many believed she had found the perfect shortcut. In an instant, she wasn't just Meghan, the actress from Suits. She was Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. But royalty carries a different kind of fame, one that doesn't always translate back into Hollywood glamour. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The move to step down from royal duties, branded as a bid for independence and freedom, was painted by Meghan and Harry as their chance to tell their story on their own terms. They framed it as liberation, a way to escape the suffocating traditions of the palace. But outside the carefully worded press releases, there were whispers that Meghan saw this as her moment to finally cement herself as an A-list celebrity. Hollywood, after all, was their new home. Multi-million-dollar deals with Netflix and Spotify seemed like a golden ticket. For a time, the couple's gamble appeared to be working. They were the subjects of headlines everywhere, fixtures at red carpet events, and collaborators with some of the biggest media platforms in the world. Yet behind the glamour, cracks quickly began to form. Projects struggled. Promises of groundbreaking documentaries and game-changing content fizzled. One by one, partnerships soured, and audiences seemed less captivated than Meghan had hoped. What was meant to be the great second act of her career started to look more like a stalled comeback. Hollywood, with its notoriously short memory and ruthless standards, was not as enchanted by the Duchess as she had believed it would be. And then came Greg Gutfeld's punchline, a brutal distillation of all those unspoken truths about her faltering ambitions. On live television, Greg turned to the audience with a smirk and mocked Meghan for leaving behind the royal family in pursuit of fame, only to discover that Hollywood wouldn't even cast her as an extra. The studio erupted with laughter. In that moment, Meghan wasn't just being teased. She was being stripped of her dignity, her aspirations laid bare for ridicule. For millions watching, the joke was more than comedy. It was confirmation of a suspicion many already held, that Meghan had traded one world of privilege for another, and yet failed to find acceptance in either. It was a takedown that resonated because it spoke to something deeper than one woman's struggles. It echoed the timeless story of what happens when ambition collides with reality. The sting of that moment wasn't just in the words, but in what they revealed. Hollywood had once been Meghan's dreamland, the place she worked so hard to break into. And now, years later, the same industry she had yearned to dominate had seemingly turned its back on her. In contrast to her carefully curated image, Greg's joke captured what many had begun to believe, that Meghan Markle was no longer a rising star, but a cautionary tale. What made it worse was the immediacy of live TV. There was no script, no opportunity to edit, no chance for her team to soften the blow before it spread across social media. Within minutes, clips of the moment were trending, replayed endlessly, and dissected by critics and supporters alike. But why did this joke land so hard with the public? Perhaps because it wasn't just about Meghan herself. It tapped into a broader narrative about fame, entitlement, and ambition. Viewers saw in Meghan a reflection of those who believe that titles, connections, and publicity can guarantee success, only to learn that the entertainment industry demands more than ambition. It demands staying power. And staying power comes from authenticity, something Meghan's critics argue she has struggled to maintain. Hollywood isn't impressed by royal titles, and television comedy doesn't respect royal sensitivities. Greg Gutfeld's jab worked because it laid bare a truth the world had been dancing around for months. Meghan's Hollywood comeback wasn't working. The humiliation was amplified by her silence afterward. Meghan, who often fights back against negative press with carefully worded statements, remained quiet on this one. Insiders suggested she was furious, enraged at being painted as irrelevant on such a large stage, but also wary of giving Greg more attention by responding. That silence, however, allowed the moment to grow legs of its own. Without a rebuttal, the public was left with Greg's words and the sound of laughter echoing in their minds. Social media users replayed the joke over and over, using it as shorthand for Meghan's perceived failures. It wasn't just a late-night jab anymore. It had become a symbol. This sets the stage for the emotional heart of the story. Meghan's relentless pursuit of fame, her sacrifices, and her refusal to let go of Hollywood's allure, all colliding with the unfiltered power of public mockery. The story of Meghan Markle isn't just about a duchess facing ridicule. It's about the fragility of reputation in a world where the cameras never stop rolling, and where one punchline can overshadow years of carefully built image management. It forces us to ask, what happens when someone who believes they were destined for the spotlight is instead defined by the laughter of strangers? And more importantly, what does Meghan do next when the applause she longs for is drowned out by the roar of mockery? The introduction leaves us on the edge of that question. Because while Greg's joke may have humiliated Meghan in the moment, it also opened a new chapter in her ongoing battle for recognition and respect. And as we move deeper into this story, we'll uncover how that single moment revealed not just the state of Meghan's Hollywood dreams, but also the fragile line between chasing fame and becoming a punchline yourself. Every dream begins somewhere, and for Meghan Markle, it began long before her name was splashed across tabloids or her face became synonymous with royal scandals. Her story started on the streets of Los Angeles, a city where dreams are sold in abundance but delivered in scarcity. From a young age, Meghan watched the world of entertainment from just close enough to taste it, but still far enough to know how elusive it could be. Her father, Thomas Markle, worked as a lighting director in television, and through him, Meghan had occasional glimpses behind the curtain of Hollywood. For many, this might have been an intimidating sight, a reminder of how high the ladder truly was. For Meghan, it was fuel. She saw not the impossibility of fame, but the possibility. And with possibility came determination. In her teenage years, Meghan didn't just talk about dreams. She began crafting the foundation for them. Acting classes, auditions, the relentless grind of standing in lines with hundreds of other hopefuls. All of these became part of her life. She knew rejection intimately, and while many would have given up after the first handful of failed auditions, Meghan pressed forward. She took bit parts, commercials, even appearances that paid little or nothing, just to have her face on a screen. Each role, no matter how small, was a step forward in her mind. This perseverance led her to land her most recognizable role as Rachel Zane in the television drama Suits. Suits was never the kind of show that dominated the world stage, but for Meghan, it was a breakthrough. It gave her a steady paycheck, name recognition, and a level of celebrity that felt tangible. Suddenly, she was no longer the girl in the background. She was part of a main cast in a hit series with a loyal fan base. It was a milestone she had chased for years, and finally, she had caught it. Yet, even with this success, Meghan's ambitions stretched further. She wanted to be more than a TV actress. She wanted to be a household name, someone whose fame extended beyond the screen and into culture itself. This hunger wasn't unusual in Hollywood. Countless actors sought the same leap, the transformation from working talent to global star. But Hollywood is a brutal judge of worth. For Meghan, the challenge was that while Suits gave her recognition, it did not give her the kind of legacy-defining fame she longed for. She began searching for ways to stand out. Interviews, charity appearances, connections with influential figures. She pursued them all, carefully curating an image of not just an actress, but a woman of substance and sophistication. Yet, despite her efforts, the walls of Hollywood's upper echelon remained stubbornly closed. It was around this time that her personal life became the spark for an opportunity larger than anything her acting career had delivered. Meeting Prince Harry changed everything. Here was a man not just of wealth or influence, but of royal blood, the kind of connection that could transform her narrative overnight. For Meghan, this was not only romance, but a doorway. Suddenly, her name was everywhere, not because of a role she played, but because of the role she was about to step into. From Los Angeles actress to Duchess of Sussex, Meghan had bypassed the Hollywood ladder entirely, vaulting straight into global celebrity. But this leap carried consequences. The very thing that made her instantly famous also began to define her entirely. Hollywood now saw her differently. No longer was she the actress from Suits chasing auditions. She was the royal who had married into one of the most famous families in the world. In the entertainment industry, that changed everything. For some, it made her intriguing, someone who could pull audiences simply by her name. For others, it made her untouchable, a woman whose identity was no longer her own, but forever linked to the monarchy. Meghan believed she could manage both worlds. She envisioned herself as someone who could redefine what it meant to be royal, blending the elegance of monarchy with the glamour of Hollywood. She saw herself as modern, relatable, and capable of wielding her fame in new, progressive ways. But Hollywood doesn't easily bend to personal visions. The industry is fickle, quick to crown its favorites and quicker still to discard them. While Meghan basked in the glow of her new status, behind the scenes, Hollywood executives began quietly questioning how she would fit into their world now. Was she a serious actress, a public figure, or simply a tabloid personality? The spark of her Hollywood dreams had not faded, but it was no longer hers alone to control. She was no longer auditioning on her own merits. She was auditioning against the weight of her new identity. And this shift planted the seeds of the tension that would later explode when Greg Gutfeld used his platform to cut her ambitions down with a single joke. The path that had begun with auditions and late nights memorizing lines had led to palaces, red carpets, and eventually, public humiliation. This first chapter of Meghan's journey reminds us that ambition is rarely straightforward. For Meghan, the dream of Hollywood was never just about acting. It was about being seen, being celebrated, and being remembered. And as we will see in the coming chapters, the pursuit of that dream, even after marrying into the most famous family in the world, came with costs she could not have anticipated. The spark that began in Hollywood was never extinguished, but it was transformed into something more volatile, something that made her both admired and despised. The decision to step away from royal duties was not a single moment, but a slow-burning choice that built up over years. For Meghan Markle, what seemed at first like a fairy tale turned into a burden she claimed was unbearable. For Prince Harry, the pressure of the royal spotlight, combined with a growing sense of resentment toward his family and the institution he was born into, pushed him to the edge. Together, they chose to do something almost unthinkable in the modern monarchy. They left. But this choice, branded by some as independence and by others as betrayal, was far more complicated than the polished statements they released to the press. It was not simply about freedom. It was about control, image, and ambition. When Meghan married into the royal family in 2018, she became part of an institution centuries old, bound by traditions and protocols that often felt suffocating. At first, the world embraced her. She was celebrated as a breath of fresh air, a modern addition to a monarchy in desperate need of relevance. Her mixed-race heritage, her background as a working actress, her outspoken nature, all were seen as signals of a new chapter for the Windsors. Crowds cheered her every appearance, and headlines hailed her as a trailblazer. Yet behind the grandeur of processions and balcony waves, Meghan discovered quickly that being royal was not what she had imagined. Unlike Hollywood, where individuality is encouraged and reinvention is celebrated, the royal family thrives on conformity. Every action, every gesture, every word spoken must fit within the carefully constructed image of the monarchy. Meghan's independence clashed with this expectation. She wanted to speak openly, to champion causes in her own way, to build a personal brand within the royal machine. But the palace system did not bend easily. For her, the scrutiny of the press became unbearable, the tabloids relentless in their criticism of everything from her wardrobe to her relationship with her in-laws. For Harry, this echoed the trauma of watching his mother, Princess Diana, hounded by the press until her tragic death. The more Meghan pushed against the constraints of royal life, the more she and Harry began to imagine an escape. They saw the confines of palace protocol not just as restrictive, but as toxic. They wanted to carve out their own path, one where they could control their narrative without being silenced by the machinery of the monarchy. Yet beneath this desire for independence lay another motivation, the chance to monetize their fame without the restrictions of royal duty. Hollywood and the global media were waiting, and Meghan, in particular, knew the power of her name outside palace walls. When the couple announced their decision in early 2020, the world was stunned. They released a statement declaring they would step back as senior royals, divide their time between North America and the UK, and work toward financial independence. To their supporters, this was bold and modern, a couple standing up for themselves against an outdated institution. To critics, it was abandonment, a rejection of responsibility, privilege, and duty in exchange for celebrity freedom. The press called it Megxit, a term that stuck, much to Meghan's frustration, as if she alone were responsible for the decision. Their escape was not clean. Negotiations with the Queen and senior royals were tense. The couple wanted to keep royal titles while also pursuing commercial opportunities, but the monarchy refused to allow such a half-in, half-out arrangement. The final agreement stripped them of official royal duties, military honors for Harry, and the use of certain titles in commercial ventures. Yet, even with these concessions, Meghan and Harry walked away with something more valuable: global attention and a platform unrestricted by palace rules. Their move to California was painted as a quest for peace and normalcy, but in reality, they moved into one of the wealthiest, most visible neighborhoods in the world, Montecito, a haven for celebrities and billionaires. Their life there was anything but ordinary. They signed multi-million-dollar deals with Netflix and Spotify, appeared on Oprah in a bombshell interview, and launched Archewell, their foundation and media brand. Every move was watched, dissected, and monetized. Far from escaping the spotlight, they had simply redirected it onto themselves in a way that allowed for profit and control. But leaving the royal family came with a heavy cost. Harry's relationships with his father and brother fractured, trust eroded, and the distance between the Sussexes and the rest of the royals grew. Meghan, once hailed as the family's modern face, was now cast as the outsider who lured Harry away from his duty. The British press portrayed her as manipulative and calculating, while American media painted her as a victim of royal cruelty. The truth likely lay somewhere in between, but perception mattered more than facts, and the perception was damning. The royal escape was a gamble, one that promised freedom but risked isolation. For Meghan, it meant returning to the world of entertainment, though not as the struggling actress she once was. Now, she returned with the title of Duchess, a name recognized worldwide. She believed this would open doors that had once been closed to her. Hollywood, however, was less welcoming than she imagined. While Netflix and Spotify offered lucrative contracts, the projects they created were met with lukewarm reception. Meghan's star power, it seemed, was not enough to guarantee success in an industry that values substance as much as spectacle. For Harry, the escape was framed as protecting his wife and children from the same fate his mother suffered. But even he could not escape the optics. Their departure was viewed by many as betrayal. The very institution he claimed to want to protect himself from was also the source of his global identity. Without the monarchy, Harry was still a prince, but his relevance depended heavily on the very family he had left behind. The paradox of their escape was clear. They wanted independence, but still relied on the monarchy as the anchor for their fame. As the dust settled, Meghan and Harry presented themselves as free spirits charting their own course. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already showing. Projects were faltering, critics were sharpening their knives, and whispers in Hollywood suggested that Meghan's ambitions were beginning to outpace her abilities. The royal escape, rather than freeing them from scrutiny, had placed them under a different kind of lens, one that judged them not as royals, but as entertainers, entrepreneurs, and celebrities. And in this world, there was no protection from failure, no centuries-old institution to shield them from ridicule. This chapter of their lives set the stage for what was to come. Meghan, once celebrated as a symbol of modern royalty, was now a woman navigating the cutthroat world of Hollywood with more eyes on her than ever before. The royal escape had given her the platform she craved, but it also set her up for the kind of public scrutiny that would eventually explode when Greg Gutfeld delivered his cutting joke. The very dream Meghan had pursued, control over her story, was slipping away again, and this time, there was no crown to lend her authority. When Meghan and Harry landed in California after their departure from the monarchy, they presented the move as a chance to reclaim their lives. They spoke of independence, family, and healing from the bruises of royal life. But beneath those words, another truth simmered. California wasn't just a place of refuge, it was a place of opportunity. For Meghan in particular, returning to the United States, and specifically to Hollywood's backyard, was more than a homecoming. It was a chance to resume the chase for stardom that had been interrupted by her marriage into the House of Windsor. She had left Hollywood years earlier with modest success, but now she returned with a new title, global recognition, and a sense that the doors which once seemed impenetrable might finally swing wide open. The Sussex's Montecito mansion became both a sanctuary and a launchpad. The sprawling estate, with its manicured gardens and celebrity neighbors, symbolized the kind of life Meghan had always imagined for herself. She was no longer a supporting actress on a cable drama. She was a duchess, a mother, and a media personality with a story the world couldn't stop talking about. The timing seemed perfect. Streaming platforms were booming, content demand was at an all-time high, and Meghan's name carried enough intrigue to draw headlines with every move she made. It seemed only natural that Netflix, Spotify, and other media giants would line up to sign her and Harry to multi-million-dollar deals. Indeed, the early deals sounded impressive. Netflix signed them to a contract reportedly worth $100 million, promising documentaries, scripted series, and even children's programming. Spotify secured them for a podcast series, and whispers circulated about Meghan writing books, launching lifestyle brands, and becoming a new kind of hybrid, part royal, part mogul, part celebrity icon. To the couple, this was more than business, it was validation. For Meghan, it felt like proof that her Hollywood dreams were not only alive, but now backed by money, influence, and an international audience. Yet Hollywood is notorious for building expectations only to watch them collapse under the weight of reality. For Meghan, the challenges became apparent almost immediately. The glitz of the announcements gave way to the grind of production, and suddenly the couple had to deliver. Documentaries were promised, scripts needed writing, podcasts required recording. The entertainment world, unlike the monarchy, demanded results, and results are judged not by press statements but by audience numbers, critical reviews, and financial returns. Their first major release with Netflix, the docuseries about their life, sparked conversation but not in the way Meghan had hoped. Critics accused it of being self-indulgent, a glossy rehash of grievances against the royal family rather than a compelling piece of storytelling. Audiences tuned in initially out of curiosity, but the fascination faded quickly, and the buzz did not translate into lasting acclaim. The couple's next efforts faced even greater hurdles. Planned projects were delayed, reshaped, or outright canceled. A children's animated series announced with fanfare quietly disappeared from Netflix's slate before it ever saw the light of day. For Hollywood insiders, this was a red flag. Big names and big deals are common in the industry, but what matters is execution, and Meghan's ventures weren't producing the kind of impact expected from contracts of that size. Spotify proved no better. Meghan's podcast launched with excitement and featured prominent guests, but despite some initial interest, the show failed to leave a significant cultural mark. By the time Spotify and the Sussexes parted ways, industry voices were openly questioning whether Meghan and Harry had the creative vision or work ethic to justify the investments poured into them. To many, it seemed as though Meghan had assumed her celebrity would guarantee success in Hollywood. But celebrity can open doors, it cannot keep them open. As these struggles mounted, Meghan leaned on her strengths: image, branding, and narrative control. Appearances in high-profile magazines, carefully staged interviews, and a constant presence in the media cycle kept her visible, but they could not substitute for actual achievements in entertainment. Hollywood may indulge the famous, but it rewards the talented, the innovative, and the hardworking. In this environment, Meghan's reliance on her title and her status as Harry's wife began to look less like an advantage and more like a crutch. The public also played its role in shaping Meghan's American comeback attempt. In the United Kingdom, she had been relentlessly criticized by the press, but in the United States, she expected a warmer embrace. Initially, that seemed to be the case. Outlets like Oprah's platform gave her sympathetic coverage, and many Americans viewed her as a victim of an outdated monarchy. But sympathy is fleeting, especially in the entertainment world. As months passed, public interest shifted from her victim narrative to her ability, or inability, to create compelling content. Without fresh, exciting achievements, the narrative turned from admiration to skepticism. Was Meghan truly a creative force, or was she simply cashing in on her royal connection? Behind the glossy surface, insiders whispered about difficulties working with Meghan. Reports circulated of projects being bogged down by her demands for perfection, her reluctance to take creative risks, and her insistence on controlling every detail. For producers, this made collaborations exhausting. For Meghan, it reinforced her belief that she was misunderstood, targeted not because of her lack of talent, but because of prejudice and bias. This tension only widened the gap between her self-image as a visionary and the industry's perception of her as a challenging partner whose output rarely matched the hype. As the American comeback attempt stumbled, Meghan's frustration grew. She had expected Hollywood to welcome her as a conquering queen returning home, but instead, she found herself in the same position she had once occupied, fighting for relevance in a world that judged her on results, not intentions. And while she had more visibility than before, she also faced more scrutiny. Every misstep was amplified, every cancellation magnified, and every lukewarm reception used as evidence that her comeback was faltering. This period was critical not just for Meghan's career, but for her identity. The royal escape had been justified as a move for freedom, but in California, she discovered that freedom carried its own chains. Without the protection of the monarchy, her success or failure rested entirely on her own shoulders. Hollywood didn't care about her titles or her grievances. It cared about whether she could deliver. And as projects faltered and critics grew bolder, the illusion of inevitability that had surrounded Meghan began to crack. The American comeback attempt wasn't just about Hollywood. It was about validation. Meghan wanted to prove to the world that she could thrive outside the palace, that she was more than a duchess, more than Harry's wife. She wanted to be a star in her own right, celebrated for her vision and talent. But Hollywood had its own verdict, one that became painfully clear when Greg Gutfeld, with the sharp edge of comedy, summed it all up in a single punchline. She had left the royals to chase fame, and yet Hollywood wouldn't even cast her as an extra. The comeback she had dreamed of was turning into the very stage for her humiliation. Late-night television has always been a battleground of wit, satire, and cultural commentary. It is the arena where politicians, celebrities, and even royalty are reduced to punchlines, their carefully constructed images dismantled with humor that often cuts sharper than any editorial. In America, comedy shows have become a powerful force in shaping public perception, and for Meghan Markle, this reality came crashing down when she became the subject of Fox News host Greg Gutfeld's scathing ridicule. To understand why his words resonated so deeply, we need to examine the landscape of late-night television, the role of comedy in holding power to account, and why Meghan, despite all her efforts, was an irresistible target. Greg Gutfeld has built his career on a reputation for unapologetic humor. His show doesn't shy away from the controversial. Instead, it thrives on it. His style is blunt, sarcastic, and deliberately provocative. Where other hosts lean into charm or playfulness, Gutfeld leans into sharpness, using irony and mockery as his primary tools. Audiences expect him to say what others won't, and in that expectation lies his power. To be mocked by Greg isn't just to be teased. It is to be stripped bare in front of millions, framed not as a victim, but as the butt of the joke. Meghan Markle, with her high-profile departure from the royal family and her rocky attempt at a Hollywood comeback, was perfect fodder. Late-night hosts, whether on mainstream networks or cable channels, know the value of a good target. Meghan and Harry had, in the years since stepping down from royal duties, positioned themselves as global figures of independence and social justice, while simultaneously signing massive media contracts. To critics, this dual identity, part humanitarian, part media mogul, reeked of hypocrisy. It was fertile ground for satire. Meghan's struggle to produce successful Hollywood content while living in luxury gave comedians an easy hook. The Duchess who left the crown to chase the camera, only to find herself unwanted in either world. The setup for Gutfeld's joke was classic late-night construction. Build tension with a commentary on current events, insert a well-timed jab, and let the audience release with laughter. But what made his particular moment sting was how it tapped into a widely shared perception. He quipped that Meghan had abandoned royal life in search of Hollywood stardom, only to discover that Hollywood wouldn't even cast her as an extra. The punchline was brutal in its simplicity, and the studio audience erupted. For viewers at home, the laughter validated the sentiment. It wasn't just Greg mocking Meghan. It was the audience, the culture, and by extension, the broader public joining in. The world of late-night comedy has long held the power to define reputations. For politicians, a single devastating joke can become a defining moment of a campaign. For celebrities, it can cement them as a cultural cliché. Meghan's humiliation was not simply about one man's joke. It was about how that joke distilled her years of effort, ambition, and controversy into a single line that millions could understand instantly. It captured the irony of her journey in a way that even hours of documentaries or interviews could not undo. What made Meghan especially vulnerable to this kind of attack was her relationship with the media itself. From the beginning, she has sought to control her narrative, to manage how she is portrayed, and to counteract criticism with carefully crafted statements or appearances. This works in interviews or magazine profiles, but late-night comedy exists outside that control. A comedian is not beholden to her PR team, her branding strategies, or her narrative framing. Once she became the subject of satire, Meghan lost control, and in the world of public perception, that loss is devastating. This was not the first time Meghan and Harry had been mocked by comedians, but the context mattered. By the time of Gutfeld's joke, their media projects had already stumbled, and whispers about their relevance were growing louder. For many in the audience, the punchline felt like confirmation rather than exaggeration. It fit neatly into the narrative that Meghan's Hollywood ambitions had failed, that her grand plans to dominate the American entertainment scene were unraveling. The reaction to the joke also highlights the unique cultural role of satire. Comedy, particularly sharp satire, often speaks truths that others shy away from. For Meghan's supporters, the joke was cruel, uncalled for, and reflective of a biased media determined to tear her down. For her critics, it was refreshing honesty, a comedic way of pointing out what they saw as hypocrisy. Either way, the fact that it sparked such a strong reaction was proof of its impact. The setup, the delivery, and the audience's eruption created a cultural moment Meghan could not erase. Hollywood insiders likely watched that moment with a mix of recognition and discomfort. In an industry where perception is everything, Meghan's public ridicule mattered. Executives who may have been cautious about working with her now had more reason to hesitate. If audiences were laughing at her rather than with her, projects attached to her name risked ridicule as well. The late-night setup wasn't just comedy. It was a mirror reflecting Hollywood's growing reluctance to embrace Meghan as the star she wanted to be. For Meghan, the aftermath was silence, but silence in this case spoke volumes. She did not respond directly to Gutfeld's mockery, perhaps recognizing that addressing it would only amplify its reach. Yet her silence left space for others to define the narrative, and they did. Clips circulated on social media, headlines picked up the moment, and memes spread across platforms. Each repetition of the joke reinforced the perception that Meghan was a failure in Hollywood, a duchess chasing dreams beyond her reach. The setup of late-night comedy thrives on cultural truths, or at least cultural perceptions. Meghan had become a figure of fascination precisely because of the contradictions in her life: royal and commoner, victim and opportunist, humanitarian and celebrity. Comedy doesn't deal in nuance. It distills complexity into a single, sharp laugh line. In Meghan's case, that distillation was merciless. One moment of laughter crystallized years of struggle and ambition into a single cultural memory. The Duchess mocked for being unwanted by the very world she pursued. This chapter of Meghan's story underscores the precariousness of public life. No matter how carefully one crafts an image, no matter how much one invests in controlling the narrative, the court of public opinion is unpredictable and ruthless. Late-night television may seem like entertainment, but it wields influence far beyond the stage. For Meghan, Greg Gutfeld's setup wasn't just a joke. It was a cultural verdict, one that would follow her as she continued her desperate attempt to prove her worth in Hollywood. When the moment arrived, it unfolded with the kind of precision comedians dream of and public figures dread. Greg Gutfeld leaned into the camera, delivering a setup that seemed harmless enough to anyone unfamiliar with his style. Then, with the sharpness of a knife and the confidence of a man who knew exactly how to electrify a crowd, he let the punchline land. He mocked Meghan Markle for leaving behind the British royal family, a life of privilege and global stature, to pursue her dreams of Hollywood glory, only to discover that Hollywood would not even consider her worthy of being cast as an extra. The studio audience erupted in laughter, a sound so loud and unified that it became as much a part of the moment as the joke itself. Comedy, especially when aimed at figures as controversial as Meghan, works because it distills complexity into a simple truth, or at least a truth that resonates with the audience. In this case, the joke crystallized what many people already suspected. Meghan had left the monarchy under the banner of independence and empowerment, only to stumble in her efforts to carve out a new identity in the entertainment industry. By the time Greg's words rang out, stories of canceled projects, failed ventures, and disappointing reception were already circulating widely. The audience didn't just laugh at the joke, they laughed because it confirmed their own impressions. The eruption of laughter in that studio was more than a reaction, it was a cultural echo. Within minutes, clips of the moment were trending online. The video spread across social media platforms, edited into memes, shared with captions mocking Meghan, and replayed by critics who relished her discomfort. For supporters of the Duchess, it was painful to watch. For her detractors, it was vindication. The speed with which the clip spread was a reminder of the digital age. One moment on live television could now ripple through millions of screens across the globe, replayed endlessly until it became part of the cultural narrative. What made Greg's joke especially brutal was its timing. It came at a point when Meghan's credibility in Hollywood was already fragile. Her Netflix projects had received lukewarm attention. Her podcast deal with Spotify had dissolved under disappointing numbers, and whispers of her being difficult to work with were making their way through industry circles. The punchline was not an exaggeration. It was a caricature of the truth, and that made it sting even more. The joke landed because it tapped into reality. Hollywood, a place Meghan once believed would embrace her with open arms, seemed to have little interest in elevating her to the level of celebrity she envisioned. The studio audience's eruption was not just laughter, it was release. Laughter is often about recognition, and in that moment, the audience recognized a shared understanding. They weren't laughing only at Meghan. They were laughing at the absurdity of her story, at the irony of a duchess chasing Hollywood stardom only to come up short. The laughter said, "We see the contradiction, and it's funny because it feels true." In comedy, truth is everything, and this moment carried with it a truth Meghan would rather have kept hidden. For Meghan, the humiliation was compounded by the inability to control the narrative. In the palace, she had some measure of control. Press officers, statements, and the weight of the royal institution to filter or spin stories. In Hollywood, and especially in the realm of satire, none of that mattered. She couldn't stop the joke from spreading, couldn't silence the laughter, and couldn't undo the damage. Her silence afterward only fueled the fire, allowing critics and commentators to define the moment however they saw fit. The global reaction added another layer. In the United Kingdom, tabloids pounced on the joke as confirmation of what they had long been writing. Meghan's star was fading, and her dreams were collapsing. Headlines amplified Greg's punchline, framing it as more evidence that Meghan and Harry's escape from royal duties was a failure. In America, the reaction was more divided. Some defended her, arguing that comedy had crossed into cruelty, while others delighted in the spectacle of a celebrity being taken down a peg. The international coverage ensured that the humiliation wasn't contained to one country, it was worldwide. What made the moment so consequential was how it fed into existing narratives. For Meghan's critics, it reinforced the image of a woman who abandoned duty for fame and failed to achieve it. For her supporters, it highlighted the relentless cruelty she faced, the way media and entertainment figures seemed eager to attack her at every opportunity. But regardless of perspective, the joke had achieved something undeniable. It made Meghan the subject of ridicule on a global scale, and that ridicule was not going away. Inside Hollywood, the moment reverberated as well. Producers and executives, already hesitant about attaching Meghan to projects, now had to consider the risk of public mockery. If she had become a punchline, would her presence hurt more than it helped? In an industry built on image, perception is everything. Meghan's name, once seen as a guaranteed draw, now carried the baggage of failure and mockery. Greg's joke may have been intended as entertainment, but it had real-world consequences. It shifted how people inside and outside the industry viewed Meghan's viability as a star. For Harry, the moment was equally damaging. Though the joke targeted Meghan, it also reflected on him. As her husband and the man who had left his family to support her ambitions, he too became part of the ridicule. If Meghan's Hollywood dreams were crumbling, what did that say about the life he had chosen? For a prince who once vowed to protect his wife at all costs, the sight of her being humiliated on live television was a painful reminder that not all battles could be won. The joke heard around the world wasn't just about Meghan's ambitions. It was about the fragility of reputation in a digital age, the power of satire to cut through carefully managed narratives, and the way one moment of laughter can undo years of effort. For Meghan, it was devastating not only because of the words, but because of the permanence of their impact. The internet ensures that such moments never die. The clip will be replayed, reshared, and referenced for years to come. This chapter marks the turning point where Meghan's ambitions collided with public perception in a way she could not control. The joke was short, but its consequences were long-lasting. It captured the essence of her struggles and broadcast them to the world, not as a tragic tale, but as a punchline. And for Meghan Markle, that was perhaps the cruelest twist of all. When the laughter died down in the studio but echoed endlessly online, Meghan Markle found herself in a position she had experienced many times before, the subject of ridicule, unable to silence the noise. Yet this time was different. This was not a tabloid headline she could dismiss as manufactured gossip, nor was it a minor snub she could spin into a story of resilience. This was a public humiliation on live television, sharpened by comedy and multiplied by social media. For someone who had built her post-royal life on carefully crafted narratives and image control, the sting of Greg Gutfeld's joke was unbearable. Meghan has always been conscious of perception. From her early days in Hollywood, she understood that reputation in the entertainment industry is everything. When she became part of the royal family, she recognized even more acutely how narratives shape power. She worked tirelessly to control her image, presenting herself as a modern duchess, a humanitarian, a voice for the voiceless. But no amount of branding could undo the punch of a joke that boiled her ambitions down to failure. Meghan's fury, insiders whispered, was immediate. Behind closed doors, she raged at her team, demanding answers, asking why this clip was allowed to spread unchecked, and what could be done to counter it. But public fury is a dangerous thing for someone in her position. Meghan knew that responding directly to Greg Gutfeld would be a mistake. Engaging him would only amplify the moment, give him more material, and make her appear defensive. So she chose silence. Yet her silence was not passive. It was strategic, the kind of silence filled with frantic behind-the-scenes phone calls, urgent meetings with advisors, and sleepless nights spent worrying about the damage being done to her reputation. Silence became both her shield and her prison. Her anger wasn't just at Greg or the audience that laughed. It was at the industry itself. Meghan had believed that Hollywood would see her differently, that her status as a duchess, her global recognition, and her carefully cultivated image would protect her from the kind of ridicule faced by ordinary celebrities. Yet here she was, mocked not just as a failed actress, but as someone irrelevant to the very world she longed to dominate. In her fury, she saw betrayal everywhere. The same industry that had courted her with lucrative deals was now leaving her exposed to ridicule, unwilling to defend her when the laughter grew loud. Those close to Meghan have often said she struggles with criticism, especially when it feels personal. And Greg's joke was deeply personal. It wasn't about her work, her fashion, or even her relationship with Harry. It was about her dreams, her ambitions, the very thing she had sacrificed so much for. To hear them dismissed with such finality, Hollywood won't even cast her as an extra, was like hearing the world tell her she didn't matter. Her fury came not only from humiliation, but from the fear that the joke might be true, that perhaps Hollywood really didn't want her. Harry bore the brunt of her frustration. As her closest confidant, he listened as she vented, repeating the injustice of it all, asking why people couldn't see her efforts for what they were. Harry, already sensitive to media attacks, was torn between his instinct to defend his wife and his recognition that comedy was something he couldn't fight. His mother, Princess Diana, had been hounded by tabloids, but satire had never defined her in the same way. For Meghan, this was new territory, being reduced to a punchline rather than a victim. And in some ways, it was even more devastating. Her fury also extended to the public. Meghan has long believed she is misunderstood, that much of the criticism directed at her is rooted in prejudice or envy. But watching the joke spread online, seeing ordinary people laugh, create memes, and echo Greg's words, she felt betrayed by the very audience she wanted to win over. These were the people she had hoped would champion her projects, stream her shows, and support her brand. Instead, they were laughing at her, using her name as a punchline in their jokes. In her silence, Meghan seethed, realizing that no amount of control could stop the tide once it turned against her. Inside her team, debates raged. Some advisors argued that she should address the moment directly, perhaps through a sympathetic interview where she could frame the joke as part of the larger pattern of media bullying she endured. Others warned against it, saying that drawing attention to the joke would only prolong its life. Meghan, caught between pride and strategy, chose to wait. But waiting only made the fury fester. Every day the clip spread. Every time her name trended with Greg's, it was another reminder of her powerlessness in the face of ridicule. Her fury wasn't just emotional, it was practical. Meghan understood that perception drives opportunity. If Hollywood began to see her as a joke, her chances of rebuilding her career would evaporate. Every potential producer or executive considering working with her would now view her through the lens of that joke. She knew she couldn't afford to be seen as irrelevant. In private, she pushed her team harder, demanding new strategies, fresh approaches, anything to prove that Greg's words were wrong. Her fury became fuel, but it was laced with desperation. And then there was the quiet humiliation of knowing the royal family had likely seen the moment. Meghan had always been sensitive to how her in-laws perceived her, and the thought of William, Kate, or Charles hearing the audience's laughter was unbearable. She imagined them smirking in silence, viewing the moment as karmic justice for her decision to walk away from the crown. That thought, perhaps more than anything else, deepened her rage. It wasn't just about her reputation in Hollywood. It was about her standing in the eyes of the family she had left behind. Meghan's silent fury became a defining moment because it revealed the fragility of her position. She had left the monarchy to escape control, only to find herself trapped in another system where control was impossible. Hollywood and the media could lift her up or tear her down, and she had little power to stop them. Her silence was a choice, but it was also an admission that she could not fight this battle on her terms. Behind the silence was rage, behind the rage was fear, and behind the fear was the dawning realization that her Hollywood dreams might never materialize the way she had envisioned. For Prince Harry, Greg Gutfeld's brutal joke aimed at Meghan was not just another piece of media noise. It was a dagger aimed at the fragile foundation he and his wife had been trying to build since leaving the royal family. Harry has always carried with him the scars of media ridicule and public scrutiny, but this time the target was not just him, it was Meghan. And her humiliation brought with it a storm he could not easily navigate. As the audience laughed at Greg's jab, Harry was thrust into a dilemma that cut to the core of his identity. How to be the protective husband he vowed to be, while facing the reality that not all battles can be fought and won. From the earliest days of their relationship, Harry positioned himself as Meghan's defender. He released unprecedented public statements condemning the media for its treatment of her, warning against the racial undertones and intrusive coverage that threatened to overwhelm their relationship. He saw in Meghan echoes of his mother's suffering, and he vowed never to let history repeat itself. Protecting her became not only a promise of love, but also an act of rebellion against the very institution he had grown disillusioned with. Yet the cruel irony of the Gutfeld moment was that the battlefield had changed. This wasn't tabloid harassment or paparazzi intrusion. It was comedy, framed as entertainment, cloaked in laughter. How do you defend someone against a punchline? Harry's private turmoil was immediate. On one hand, his instinct was to fight. He wanted to shield Meghan from the pain of being mocked, to push back against what he saw as disrespect and cruelty. On the other hand, he knew that responding would only fan the flames. If he issued a statement or made a public show of anger, the story would explode even further, giving Greg and his audience exactly what they wanted, proof that the joke had landed. For Harry, whose life had been a constant tug-of-war between impulse and restraint, this was agony. Behind closed doors, those close to the couple say Harry struggled to comfort Meghan. He reminded her that comedy thrives on exaggeration, that public figures from presidents to pop stars had endured similar treatment. But even as he said the words, he knew they rang hollow. Meghan's pain was not just about the joke itself. It was about what the joke represented. It symbolized her fear that she was failing in Hollywood, that her ambitions were being dismissed, and that the very world she had sacrificed so much to join did not want her. Harry could not argue against that because, deep down, he shared the same fears. For Harry, the dilemma was personal as well. He had left his family, his military roles, and his homeland for Meghan. Every step he took in the years since stepping down as a senior royal had been framed as an act of devotion to her and their shared vision. But Greg's punchline painted that sacrifice in a new light. If Meghan was seen as irrelevant, if Hollywood rejected her, then what did that say about Harry's choices? Was he now a prince who abandoned his birthright for a dream that was crumbling? The laughter that echoed around the world wasn't just mocking Meghan, it was mocking him too. This inner conflict gnawed at Harry. He wanted to lash out, to reclaim control, but he was also painfully aware of the optics. His reputation, already battered by criticism that he had turned his back on duty, could not survive another wave of accusations that he was thin-skinned or desperate. He had always hated the tabloids, but at least in that arena, he knew the rules of the game. Comedy was different. Comedy was untouchable, shielded by the defense of free speech and humor. To fight it was to lose before even starting. Harry's dilemma extended beyond personal feelings to the broader question of their joint future. He and Meghan had staked everything on building a life in America, tied to media, storytelling, and content creation. If the perception of Meghan as a failed Hollywood hopeful solidified, then their entire strategy was at risk. How could they sell themselves as cultural influencers, as media innovators, if they were viewed as little more than a fading novelty? For Harry, the fear was not just for Meghan's career, but for their financial and reputational survival. The joke, in its simplicity, had shaken the foundation of everything they had built. Those close to Harry say he turned his frustration inward. He replayed his choices in his mind, wondering if he had led Meghan into a battle she could not win. He thought of Diana, how her struggles with media scrutiny had ended in tragedy, and wondered if he had underestimated the cruelty of the spotlight. He questioned whether leaving the royal family had truly protected Meghan, or whether it had left her more exposed than ever. The joke wasn't just a line on a television show. It was a mirror reflecting the cracks in the life he had chosen. At the same time, Harry wrestled with loyalty. He could see Meghan's rage, her hurt, her sense of betrayal, and he knew she expected him to stand with her. To remain silent might feel like weakness, yet to speak up would be reckless. His dilemma was not simply about what to do. It was about how to balance the roles of husband, protector, and public figure in a world that demanded impossible choices. In the end, his silence, like Meghan's, was a reluctant compromise. They both knew they could not win this battle publicly, so they chose to absorb the blow privately. But the silence did not erase the damage. It only buried it deeper. Harry's dilemma is perhaps best understood as the cost of choosing love over duty. He had walked away from the only life he had ever known to build something new with Meghan. That decision came with sacrifices, relationships, titles, respect. He had believed that in America, free from the rigid constraints of monarchy, they could flourish. Yet here he was, watching his wife reduced to a punchline, powerless to stop it. His dilemma was not just about Greg Gutfeld's joke. It was about the realization that no matter where he went, the laughter and judgment of the world would always follow. This chapter of Harry's life revealed a man torn between instinct and strategy, between rage and restraint, between love and fear. He wanted to protect Meghan, but he also knew that some battles could not be fought. His silence may have spared them a bigger scandal, but it came at the cost of feeling helpless, a feeling Harry has never tolerated well. For Meghan, his support mattered, but for Harry, the dilemma lingered. Had he done enough, and was there ever enough he could do to shield her from a world determined to laugh? When Greg Gutfeld's joke about Meghan Markle burst into the airwaves, the immediate laughter of the live studio audience was only the beginning. What followed was a media storm that spread with a speed and ferocity Meghan and Harry could not contain. Within minutes of the broadcast, clips were being cut, uploaded, and shared across platforms. Social media thrives on short, sharp moments that capture cultural contradictions, and this punchline was perfect for the digital age. It was short enough to fit into a tweet, memorable enough to be turned into a meme, and biting enough to spark outrage or applause depending on who was watching. The frenzy began almost instantly, and within hours, it had become one of the most talked about segments in entertainment and royal coverage alike. For tabloids in the United Kingdom, this was fuel for the fire. Meghan had long been a lightning rod for criticism in the British press, accused of manipulating Harry, abandoning duty, and cashing in on her royal title. Now, here was a respected television personality in America making fun of the very thing British papers had been writing about for years, her pursuit of Hollywood relevance. Headlines blared with glee, quoting Greg's punchline as though it were evidence, a final verdict on Meghan's American experiment. Tabloids used the clip to reinforce their narrative that Meghan was overreaching, desperate, and destined to fail. Across the Atlantic, American media handled the story differently. While conservative outlets picked up the joke and replayed it with amusement, liberal-leaning publications debated whether the moment was unfair or cruel. Some commentators argued that Meghan was being subjected to relentless mockery in a way that reflected deeper societal prejudices, particularly against outspoken women of color. Others countered that Meghan had placed herself in this position by constantly courting the spotlight, and that public figures cannot demand fame without also accepting ridicule. The conversation spiraled into debates about comedy, free speech, and the boundaries of criticism. Social media was a battlefield of its own. On platforms like Twitter and TikTok, the clip became a viral soundbite. Users edited the joke into montages of Meghan's public appearances, overlaying it with dramatic captions mocking her failed projects. On the other side, Meghan's defenders rallied, calling out Greg for cruelty and accusing him of punching down. Hashtags trended in both directions, some celebrating the humiliation, others demanding respect for Meghan's struggles. The polarization was stark, but for Meghan, the effect was the same. She was trending worldwide, not for a successful project or a humanitarian effort, but for being mocked on live television. For Hollywood insiders, the media frenzy had practical implications. The industry is always watching, always assessing the cultural temperature. Executives pay close attention not only to audience numbers, but to perception, because perception drives profitability. Meghan's association with failure, already a quiet undercurrent in the industry, was now amplified. If comedians could get audiences to erupt in laughter at the idea of her being irrelevant, then attaching her name to a project became risky. The frenzy hardened doubts, and in Hollywood, doubts kill deals faster than bad scripts. What made the frenzy especially damaging was how it overshadowed everything else Meghan and Harry were trying to build. Their Archwell Foundation, their supposed plans for future documentaries, Meghan's attempts to reintroduce herself as a lifestyle figure. All of it was drowned out by the roar of laughter and debate over Greg's joke. The media had chosen its story, and in that story Meghan was not a visionary or a survivor. She was the punchline. Harry, too, was pulled into the whirlwind. Though the joke targeted Meghan, the coverage inevitably dragged his name into the conversation. Commentators noted that he had sacrificed his family ties and royal privileges to stand by Meghan, only to see her publicly ridiculed. Some framed him as a tragic figure, caught in the fallout of his wife's ambitions. Others mocked him as complicit, suggesting he was now paying the price for leaving the monarchy. The frenzy, in short, did not stop with Meghan, it enveloped them both. The palace remained silent, but the British press speculated endlessly about what the royal family must have thought. Imagined smirks from William, quiet satisfaction from Charles, icy disdain from Camilla. These images filled columns, further feeding the drama. Whether true or not, the narrative took hold. Meghan's humiliation was a moment of vindication for the Windsors, proof that she could not thrive outside their structure. The media frenzy did not just report this speculation, it magnified it, making it feel real even without confirmation. As the frenzy escalated, the couple's supporters tried to push back with counter-narratives. They pointed to Meghan's charity work, her role as a mother, her resilience in the face of criticism. Yet these stories struggled to gain traction against the tidal wave of humor and ridicule. In the attention economy, the sharpest and most entertaining content wins. A biting joke will always travel further than a serious defense. Meghan found herself once again in the position of trying to tell her story, only to discover that the public preferred the version told by others. The frenzy also highlighted a brutal truth about modern fame. Once a narrative takes hold, it is almost impossible to reverse. Meghan had wanted to frame her post-royal life as one of empowerment, independence, and creativity. The media frenzy recast it as desperation, irrelevance, and failure. Every article, every meme, every late-night segment that picked up on Greg's joke reinforced that framing. The longer it lasted, the harder it became to shift public perception back in her favor. Inside Montecito, the couple watched the storm unfold. Meghan stewed in her silent fury, Harry wrestled with his helplessness, and their team scrambled to devise strategies. But no matter what they tried, the joke kept spreading. In the media frenzy, they were no longer participants in their own story. They were spectators, watching as others defined them. For two people who had left the monarchy to control their narrative, this was the ultimate irony. They had traded one cage for another, and this one was built from laughter and headlines they could not escape. The media frenzy surrounding Greg Gutfeld's joke was not just another scandal in Meghan and Harry's long list of controversies. It was a turning point, a moment when the world collectively decided how to see Meghan, not as a duchess, not as a humanitarian, but as a failed actress chasing a dream that had already slipped away. The frenzy ensured that the joke was not confined to a single night of television. It became part of Meghan's story, etched into the cultural memory. And for Meghan and Harry, the realization was devastating. This was no longer about what they did or said. It was about what the world wanted to believe. When Greg Gutfeld's joke cut through the air and the world erupted in laughter, it was not just Meghan and Harry who felt the sting. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in the halls of palaces lined with portraits and legacies, members of the British royal family were watching, listening, and calculating. They did not need to issue statements. They did not need to gather cameras or release words of criticism. For them, silence was enough. Silence, coupled with the satisfaction of knowing that Meghan, the woman who had so defiantly walked away from their centuries-old institution, was now being ridiculed not by the British press, but by Americans on their own soil. The spectacle was a kind of vindication, a moment that required no royal intervention, for the world itself seemed to be delivering judgment. From the earliest days of Meghan's entry into the royal family, tension had simmered between her and the other senior royals. There were smiles for the cameras, polite nods at events, but behind closed doors, there were frictions over protocol, expectations, and Meghan's refusal to conform to the traditions that bound everyone else. For Queen Elizabeth, whose life was dedicated to duty and restraint, Meghan's insistence on independence was both alien and disruptive. For Charles, it was a reminder of the instability he so often tried to contain. For William and Kate, it was a direct challenge to the future they were preparing for, a disruption to the order they would one day inherit. When Meghan and Harry announced their departure, the palace had been blindsided. The public statement, released without prior royal coordination, was seen as a betrayal of trust. Negotiations followed, painful and awkward, culminating in the removal of privileges, patronages, and military honors. For the royal family, this was not just about procedure, it was about protecting the institution. To them, Meghan and Harry had traded tradition for profit, loyalty for celebrity, duty for freedom. And now, years later, the Gutfeld moment seemed to confirm that their choice had been foolish. It is not the way of the monarchy to gloat openly. The family operates on subtlety, on carefully curated appearances, on words spoken, or left unspoken, with precision. But those close to the Windsors knew that the clip of Greg mocking Meghan would not go unnoticed. It would be replayed in private rooms, referenced in quiet conversations, perhaps even shared in whispers with a sense of satisfaction. For a family often portrayed as cold and calculating, this moment provided a quiet vindication. Meghan, who had tried to upstage them, was now the object of ridicule. They didn't have to lift a finger. The royal family's quiet smile was not just about Meghan's humiliation. It was about the reaffirmation of their own power. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, divorces, and abdications. It had weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser institutions. Meghan's departure, while dramatic, was ultimately just another chapter. And now, as she faced laughter and mockery in Hollywood, the family could rest easy knowing that the crown's authority remained intact. Their silence spoke volumes. She had left them behind, but it was she, not them, who had become the laughingstock. For William, in particular, the moment carried symbolic weight. As the future king, he had long been wary of Meghan's influence over Harry. He saw her as disruptive, as someone unwilling to play the role expected of a royal. His clashes with Harry over Meghan strained their once-close bond, and in the years since Megxit, that rift had only widened. Watching Meghan mocked so publicly may not have erased the pain of losing his brother's loyalty, but it offered something else. Confirmation that his instincts had been right. William's path remained clear, his role secure, while Harry and Meghan floundered in search of a purpose. Kate, too, likely felt a quiet satisfaction. Often compared to Meghan in the press, she had endured her own share of criticism and intrusion. But unlike Meghan, she had embraced the royal script, weathering storms with composure, and in time, she earned respect even from critics. Meghan, by contrast, rejected the script and sought to write her own story. The result was laughter at her expense. For Kate, the contrast could not have been clearer. Endurance and restraint had preserved her dignity, while defiance had led Meghan to mockery. Charles, now king, viewed the moment through the lens of legacy. His reign, fragile in its early years, depended on stability and continuity. Harry and Meghan had once threatened that with their explosive interviews and documentaries, casting shadows over the family. But now, the joke showed that their power to damage the monarchy was fading. If Meghan was being reduced to a punchline, then the monarchy no longer needed to fear her narrative. The world had moved on, and in moving on, it had left Meghan diminished. For Charles, who had always worried about scandal tarnishing the crown, this was reassurance. Even Camilla, long accustomed to public mockery herself, would have recognized the irony. She had endured years of being vilified as the other woman. Her reputation dragged through the mud. And yet, through patience and persistence, she had outlasted her critics, eventually becoming queen. Meghan, by contrast, had turned herself into a cultural lightning rod in a fraction of that time. To see Meghan mocked so harshly must have felt like poetic justice. Another reminder that in the world of public opinion, endurance often wins over rebellion. The quiet smile of the royal family was not only personal, it was strategic. By saying nothing, by refusing to comment, they allowed the moment to grow on its own. Every time the clip was shared, every time Greg's words were replayed, the damage to Meghan compounded. The monarchy did not need to interfere. The world was doing the work for them. In their silence, they maintained the moral high ground, appearing above the fray while enjoying the spectacle from a distance. But behind the quiet smiles was also a recognition of the broader truth. Meghan and Harry had lost control of their narrative. When they left the monarchy, they promised to tell their story on their terms. They envisioned themselves as global influencers, shaping conversations, redefining modern royalty. Yet here they were, mocked on a late-night stage, their story told not by them, but by comedians and commentators. For the royal family, this was the ultimate victory. They had been accused, criticized, and blamed, but in the end, the couple who had tried to outmaneuver them were reduced to laughter. The irony of the moment is stark. Meghan had left the monarchy to escape scrutiny, yet now she faced an even harsher form of it. She had hoped to step into Hollywood and find validation, yet Hollywood had shrugged. And as the world laughed, the royals smiled quietly, knowing that history was once again on their side. The monarchy, for all its flaws, had endured. Meghan, for all her ambition, was faltering. And in that contrast, the Windsors found their quiet satisfaction. The aftermath of Greg Gutfeld's sharp joke did not just linger in studios or across media outlets. It seeped into living rooms, cafes, social media platforms, and conversations around the world. Public reaction to Meghan Markle's humiliation was a tidal wave that revealed more about cultural divisions, perceptions of fame, and lingering views of royalty than it did about the joke itself. For every person who thought Greg went too far, there were many more who found themselves laughing, not only at the punchline, but at what they believed it represented. Public reaction became its own story, and Meghan's name once again became a battlefield for opinion. In Britain, the response was particularly fierce. Meghan had long been portrayed as a divisive figure in the UK press, with critics accusing her of undermining tradition, damaging the monarchy, and manipulating Harry into leaving his royal role. For these audiences, Greg's joke was not seen as cruel, but as vindication. It was as though an American voice had finally echoed what they had been saying all along, that Meghan's grand designs for fame had collapsed. The laughter from the studio audience became, for many in the UK, the sound of justice. It reinforced their view that Meghan's attempts to outshine the royal family had failed spectacularly. On social media, particularly in British circles, the joke was replayed endlessly with captions mocking Meghan's ambitions. Hashtags trended, memes flourished, and comment sections filled with schadenfreude. Some users pointed out the irony that Meghan had once claimed to want privacy, only to pursue the most public arena possible. Others noted how the audience's laughter felt like a collective sigh of relief, that the Duchess who once commanded headlines was now the butt of them. The joke became a cultural shorthand for her supposed irrelevance, a one-liner that encapsulated years of suspicion and resentment. In the United States, reactions were more mixed, but no less intense. For critics of Meghan, Greg's words landed like a hammer, breaking through the carefully polished narrative she had built. They saw the joke as confirmation that her Hollywood projects were not resonating, that she had lost credibility in an industry that judges success harshly. For others, however, the moment sparked anger. Supporters argued that Meghan was being unfairly targeted, that the ridicule reflected deeper societal biases against women who defy expectations, and that the mockery ignored her achievements as a humanitarian and advocate. To them, the laughter was cruel, dismissive, and undeserved. The divide in public reactions highlighted just how polarizing Meghan had become. She was no longer seen simply as Harry's wife or as a former actress turned duchess. She was a cultural symbol, onto which people projected their frustrations, their admiration, or their disdain. To her detractors, she represented entitlement, ambition, and hypocrisy. To her defenders, she symbolized resilience, progress, and independence. The joke exposed these fault lines, magnifying them until they became impossible to ignore. Beyond the Atlantic divide, the global response also carried weight. In countries where the monarchy holds symbolic significance, Canada, Australia, and parts of the Commonwealth, the reaction mirrored Britain's. People saw the moment as proof that the Sussexes' gamble had not paid off, that leaving the royal family had left them adrift. In other parts of the world, where Meghan's story was less tied to royal politics, the reaction focused on the universality of her struggle, a woman chasing her dreams, only to be mocked when she fell short. The humiliation resonated because it was relatable. Who hasn't feared failure, or being laughed at for reaching too high? But the fact that Meghan's failure was so public made it all the more riveting. Among Hollywood circles, public reaction was more subdued but no less significant. Industry insiders rarely comment openly on such controversies, but whispers spread quickly. Meghan's public perception mattered to them because it affected her marketability. If audiences were laughing at her instead of rooting for her, then projects associated with her carried risk. Executives, producers, and investors followed the public reactions closely, gauging whether Meghan was still bankable. The frenzy of online laughter and debate tilted the scales further against her. To many in the industry, the reaction was not just entertainment, it was data. Public reaction also spilled into Meghan's fan base, often referred to as her defenders online. They mobilized quickly, creating threads and posts defending her from Greg's mockery. They argued that the entertainment industry had always been harsh on women, especially women of color, and that Meghan was being held to impossible standards. They pointed to her philanthropic efforts, her work on mental health awareness, and her courage in speaking out against the monarchy. For them, the laughter was not just about Meghan. It was about silencing women who dared to step out of line. Yet their defenses, however passionate, struggled to match the viral spread of the original joke. The intensity of public reaction also reflected the modern media environment. In an age where moments are clipped, shared, and endlessly replayed, people are no longer passive consumers. They are participants. They take sides, create content, and amplify narratives. Greg's joke became not just a late-night moment, but a global talking point because the public made it so. Their reactions gave it life, extending its reach far beyond the original broadcast. For Meghan, this was a nightmare. Public reaction had transformed a single joke into a defining cultural moment. For Harry, watching the public react was as painful as hearing the joke itself. He had hoped that by moving to America, Meghan would be embraced rather than attacked. The mixed reactions made it clear that even across the Atlantic, Meghan was no safer from ridicule than she had been in Britain. The sight of people laughing at her humiliation deepened his sense of helplessness. For Meghan, every meme, every sarcastic tweet, every headline quoting Greg's words was a reminder that public opinion could turn her life into a spectacle at any moment. The reactions also revealed a hard truth about fame. It is not something you control, no matter how hard you try. Meghan had invested years into shaping her narrative, into crafting a story of empowerment and resilience. Yet in the end, the public chose the story they wanted to believe, and they expressed it with laughter. That laughter echoed across nations, across demographics, and across social divides. It showed that once someone becomes a symbol, they no longer belong to themselves. They belong to the public imagination. The public's reactions, divided as they were, cemented the moment in history. For some, it was a victory, a takedown of a woman they saw as overreaching. For others, it was a cruel attack on a woman who had already endured enough. But for Meghan and Harry, the result was the same. They were once again at the mercy of global opinion, their story shaped not by what they said or did, but by how the world chose to react. And this time, the reaction was louder, sharper, and more humiliating than anything they could have anticipated. Hollywood is a battlefield unlike any other. It is a place where reputations are built on whispers, where careers can rise on one role and collapse on one scandal, and where even those who claw their way to the top are never safe from being replaced. Meghan Markle entered this world once as a young actress fighting for auditions, and she returned years later with the title of Duchess and a platform most struggling performers could only dream of. But Hollywood has no permanent loyalty. It rewards relevance, consistency, and charisma that connects with audiences. And when Meghan tried to stake her claim in this unforgiving arena, she discovered that royal titles and public notoriety meant very little when it came to the actual business of entertainment. Her battle with Hollywood began the moment she and Harry settled into their California mansion. Almost immediately, the deals came pouring in. Netflix, Spotify, publishing contracts, signs that the industry was eager to harness the intrigue surrounding them. Yet these deals were not necessarily a reflection of Meghan's talent or vision. They were bets, investments based on the assumption that public fascination with the Sussexes would translate into viewership and sales. Hollywood executives knew the couple commanded headlines, but headlines are not the same as successful productions. What followed was the gradual unraveling of those expectations. The Netflix deal was supposed to be a defining moment. Meghan and Harry promised to produce documentaries, scripted dramas, and children's programming. They spoke of storytelling that would inspire and uplift, of projects that would redefine their place in the cultural conversation. But the actual results were thin. The docuseries about their lives garnered initial attention, but critics described it as self-serving and repetitive. Other projects stalled, reshaped, or vanished quietly before release. For Netflix, which invests heavily in content with the expectation of returns, the couple's inability to deliver hits raised questions about their long-term viability. Spotify was no better. Meghan's podcast, announced with excitement and teased as a platform where she would bring forward unheard voices, stumbled after a handful of episodes. While the first release drew listeners out of curiosity, it did not build the kind of loyal audience needed to sustain success. Reports of creative disagreements, scheduling delays, and lack of originality began to circulate. When the partnership ended, Spotify executives made thinly veiled comments about the Sussexes not meeting expectations. In Hollywood terms, this was damning. It suggested that Meghan, for all her influence, struggled to convert attention into substance. Hollywood insiders talk, and whispers travel fast. Meghan's reputation began to shift from intriguing newcomer to high-maintenance partner. Reports emerged of endless demands, of projects stalling under her control, of creative teams frustrated by her insistence on perfection without clarity of vision. Producers, already wary of working with celebrities who carry heavy baggage, began to hesitate. And in an industry where hesitation often equals rejection, Meghan's opportunities shrank. The contrast between Meghan's expectations and Hollywood's response was striking. She had believed that her status as a duchess and global figure would guarantee her a place at the table. But Hollywood doesn't operate on status alone. It thrives on talent, charisma, and above all, audience demand. Meghan's attempts to frame herself as both a serious humanitarian and a glamorous celebrity left her straddling two worlds without fully belonging to either. To executives, she was not Angelina Jolie, who parlayed her fame into humanitarian influence without losing credibility as an actress. She was not Oprah, who built an empire on connection and storytelling. Meghan was Meghan, famous, yes, but not proven in the ways Hollywood requires. The Gutfeld joke, then, was more than just comedy. It reflected Hollywood's growing reluctance to embrace her. By mocking her as someone who couldn't even be cast as an extra, Greg gave voice to an industry sentiment that few would say aloud but many privately believed. She was not being courted as a star. She was being humored, tested, and increasingly dismissed. For Meghan, this rejection was especially bitter because Hollywood had once been her dream. Before the royal titles and the headlines, she had been a working actress, hustling for recognition. To return years later, only to face laughter instead of applause, was crushing. It wasn't simply professional, it was personal. Hollywood represented the validation she had chased for decades, the dream that had driven her through rejection after rejection. To find herself mocked on the world stage was not just about one joke. It was about her deepest ambitions slipping through her hands. The battle between Meghan and Hollywood was not just external, it was internal as well. She wrestled with the knowledge that her critics were not entirely wrong. Her projects had struggled. Her output had not matched the hype. And yet, in her mind, she had worked hard, invested energy, and poured herself into building something meaningful. The disconnect between how she saw herself and how Hollywood saw her widened, leaving her isolated. For Meghan, this was not just a career struggle. It was an identity crisis. Meanwhile, Hollywood moved on. The industry is always hungry for the next big thing, and attention quickly shifted to other stars, other projects, other controversies. Meghan and Harry's names no longer carried the same excitement they once did. Instead, they carried baggage, associations with failure, with overreach, with ridicule. For an industry that thrives on momentum, this was deadly. Once momentum is lost, it is nearly impossible to regain. The irony is that Meghan had once believed Hollywood would give her freedom from the constraints of royalty. She thought she could define herself on her own terms, unshackled by tradition and expectation. Instead, she found herself trapped once again, this time by the demands of an industry that valued results over titles. In many ways, the palace had offered her more protection than Hollywood ever would. At least within the monarchy, she had a role, a place, and a measure of authority. In Hollywood, She was just another celebrity fighting for relevance in a crowded arena. The battle between Meghan and Hollywood is ongoing, but the trend is clear. She wants validation. Hollywood demands results. And in that clash lies the heart of her struggle. Until she delivers something undeniable, something that resonates with audiences and critics alike, Hollywood will continue to view her not as a star, but as a risk. Greg Gutfeld's joke did not create that perception, it simply revealed it. The laughter that echoed around the world was not just comedy. It was Hollywood's verdict, distilled into one brutal punchline. For Greg Gutfeld, the moment he delivered his jab at Meghan Markle was not just another joke in a long career of sharp humor. It was a cultural flashpoint, one that resonated far beyond the walls of his studio. When the laughter erupted and the clip began to spread across the globe, Greg knew he had struck gold. Satirists live for those moments when their words transcend the show and become part of the broader conversation. For him, this was validation, not only of his comedic instincts but also of his ability to tap into what audiences were already thinking but perhaps unwilling to say aloud. Greg's entire brand thrives on cutting through what he perceives as self-importance and hypocrisy. Meghan Markle, with her royal titles, celebrity ambitions, and carefully curated public image, represented everything he loves to mock. When he reduced her entire Hollywood journey to a single devastating punchline, he was not simply making a joke. He was claiming ownership over a narrative. The audience's reaction confirmed what he already believed, that Meghan had become less of an inspirational figure and more of an easy target. In the days following the broadcast, Greg doubled down. He referenced the moment again on his show, laughing along with clips and leaning into the controversy. Where others might have softened their stance or offered clarification, Greg reveled in the backlash. He knew Meghan's defenders would call his joke cruel, perhaps even unfair. But controversy is currency in late-night comedy, and for Greg, every angry article or outraged tweet only extended the lifespan of the joke. His unapologetic stance became part of the victory lap. He didn't need to retract or explain. He simply let the laughter carry him forward. The media helped fuel his triumph. Conservative outlets replayed the clip with relish, framing Greg as the comedian who had dared to say what others were too polite to acknowledge. Opinion pieces praised his willingness to puncture the bubble of celebrity entitlement, arguing that Meghan had courted fame and therefore had to accept ridicule when it came. On social media, Greg was celebrated as a truth-teller, someone who had crystallized in 10 seconds what entire essays and commentaries had struggled to convey. For him, it was confirmation that comedy still had the power to shape narratives in an age dominated by spin. What made Greg's victory lap particularly powerful was Meghan's silence. By refusing to respond directly, she left the stage entirely to him. In comedy, the absence of rebuttal often makes the joke stronger. Each day she remained quiet. The moment grew larger, replayed in headlines and comment threads without resistance. Greg seized on this, positioning himself not just as a comedian, but as a cultural commentator who had exposed the gap between Meghan's ambitions and her reality. Silence from Meghan was read by many as proof of defeat. For Greg's fans, the moment became a rallying cry. They used his words as shorthand whenever Meghan's name came up, repeating the punchline across platforms and embedding it into the broader cultural discourse. For them, Greg had done more than land a joke. He had delivered a truth. And in the polarized landscape of modern media, truth framed through comedy carries enormous weight. The victory lap was not just about ratings or applause. It was about embedding a cultural perception so deeply that it could not be undone. Inside Hollywood, Greg's triumph was viewed differently. While some insiders dismissed him as a provocateur catering to a particular audience, others recognized that his words carried influence. The perception of Meghan as a failed Hollywood hopeful was now widespread, and Greg had given that perception its most memorable expression. For executives, producers, and investors, perception is as important as reality. Greg had, in effect, turned Meghan into a liability with a single punchline. His victory lap, then, was not just comedic, it was strategic, shaping how an entire industry viewed her potential. Greg's victory also reflected the shifting nature of late-night television. Where traditional hosts often lean into light-hearted banter or carefully balanced critiques, Greg leaned into cultural warfare. His comedy wasn't designed to make everyone laugh. It was designed to resonate with those who already shared his skepticism of celebrity culture. Meghan, with her carefully staged interviews and media projects, represented the perfect foil. His victory lap wasn't just about mocking her. It was about positioning himself as the voice of those tired of what they saw as performative fame. The impact on Meghan was profound. Every time Greg repeated the joke, every time the clip resurfaced, it reinforced her humiliation. For her, Greg's victory lap was salt in the wound, a reminder that she had lost control of her story. For Harry, it was further proof that silence offered no protection. The more they tried to move past it, the more the moment followed them. Greg, meanwhile, basked in the glow of having shaped the conversation, content to let the world do the work of amplifying his words. Greg's victory lap was not a one-night event. It was a ripple effect. It lingered in headlines, in conversations, in the cultural memory of anyone following Meghan and Harry's post-royal saga. For Meghan, it was a humiliation she could not erase. For Greg, it was a career highlight, a moment when comedy intersected with cultural truth and delivered lasting impact. His triumph lay not only in the laughter he provoked, but in the way his words crystallized into something more enduring. A cultural verdict that Meghan's Hollywood dreams were not only failing, but laughable. In the wake of the humiliation, Meghan Markle faced a choice: retreat into silence and let the moment define her, or fight back with everything she had to reclaim her image. For someone who had built her life on persistence, reinvention, and carefully managed narratives, retreat was never going to be an option. Meghan knew that in the world of media and entertainment, perception is everything, and once perception calcifies, it becomes nearly impossible to reverse. Greg Gutfeld's joke had painted her as a failed Hollywood hopeful, and the laughter that followed had etched that image into the public imagination. To survive, Meghan needed to push back, to craft a counterstory strong enough to challenge the ridicule. Her first instinct was to lean on what had worked before, appearances that highlighted her as a humanitarian and public figure rather than a celebrity chasing relevance. In the months following the joke, she arranged high-profile charity visits, spoke at conferences, and emphasized her work on issues like gender equality, mental health, and social justice. These appearances were carefully photographed and widely circulated, meant to remind the public that she was more than the punchline of a late-night joke. By positioning herself as a serious voice on important issues, Meghan hoped to drown out the noise of ridicule with the gravitas of substance. But the fight to reclaim her image wasn't limited to charity appearances. Meghan also turned to the power of media partnerships. Magazine spreads, often styled with soft lighting and intimate interviews, became tools of rehabilitation. Glossy profiles painted her as misunderstood, a woman unfairly targeted by a cruel media cycle. These interviews often contained subtle digs at her critics, reframing her struggles as evidence of resilience. The aim was clear: to remind audiences that she was not a failed actress or an irrelevant duchess, but a woman navigating extraordinary challenges with courage. Still, the fight was uphill. Each glossy profile or staged photo op was immediately dissected online, with critics mocking her attempts at reinvention. The laughter from Greg's jokes still lingered, and every attempt to rebuild was measured against it. The problem Meghan faced was that narrative is not controlled by intention alone. It is shaped by reception, and the public was no longer willing to accept her self-presentation at face value. For every article praising her humanitarian work, there were dozens of online posts reminding the world of the punchline. Recognizing the limitations of traditional PR, Meghan also sought to expand her digital footprint. Social media, once a platform she abandoned when joining the royal family, became a space she cautiously re-entered. Through carefully curated posts, often highlighting family life or behind-the-scenes glimpses of projects, she attempted to present herself as relatable, modern, and accessible. The strategy was to humanize her, to make her appear less like a celebrity chasing relevance and more like a working mother juggling responsibilities. It was an effort to soften her image, to counteract the perception of entitlement. At the same time, Meghan tried to revitalize her creative reputation. She pitched new projects, sought collaborations with respected figures, and attempted to reframe herself as a producer and visionary rather than merely a former actress. The goal was to shift the conversation from her personal life to her professional output. Yet here again, she faced challenges. Hollywood, still wary from failed projects and the weight of public ridicule, hesitated to fully embrace her. Meetings were taken, ideas discussed, but concrete deals were fewer and less ambitious than before. The industry respected her name, but doubted her ability to deliver. The fight also took a personal toll. Those close to Meghan noted her frustration, her exhaustion, and her determination. She was relentless, constantly pushing her team to find new ways to control the narrative, to secure opportunities, to prove Greg's words wrong. But the more she tried, the more her efforts seemed tinged with desperation. For her critics, this desperation only reinforced the image of irrelevance. For her supporters, it was evidence of resilience. Meghan's fight to reclaim her image became yet another dividing line in public opinion. Harry played a crucial role in this battle. He stood beside her at appearances, offered supportive words in interviews, and emphasized their joint mission. But even he could not fully shield her from the reality that her image was slipping. For Harry, the fight was also personal. Meghan's reputation was tied to his own. The more she was mocked, the more his decision to leave the monarchy was questioned. Together, they fought not just for Meghan's image, but for the survival of the life they had chosen. Meghan's fight to reclaim her image revealed the paradox of modern fame. The tools that allow someone to build a brand, media, social platforms, interviews, are the same tools that can amplify mockery and ridicule. Meghan tried to use those tools to her advantage, but they often betrayed her, highlighting the contrast between her intentions and the public's reception. No matter how polished the photo shoots, no matter how heartfelt the interviews, the shadow of the joke remained. Yet despite the setbacks, Meghan refused to give up. She believed, as she always had, that persistence could outlast ridicule. The fight to reclaim her image was not a sprint, but a marathon. She knew that narratives shift with time, that public attention eventually moves on to new targets. Her strategy became one of endurance. Outlast the ridicule, continue to appear, continue to work, and eventually, perhaps, the world would forget the laughter. In this chapter of her life, Meghan was both vulnerable and defiant. Vulnerable because the humiliation had cut deeply, defiant because she refused to let it define her. The fight to reclaim her image was ongoing, and the outcome uncertain. But for Meghan, surrender was not an option. She would continue to fight, even if every step forward was met with another reminder of the punchline that had shaken her so profoundly. When the laughter faded, when the headlines moved on, and when the memes slowed their relentless pace, the real work of reflection began. For Meghan Markle, the sting of Greg Gutfeld's punchline wasn't only about the personal humiliation of being reduced to a joke. It was about what that moment revealed, not just about her, but about fame, ambition, and the world she had chosen to enter. The lessons from that humiliation were sharp, uncomfortable, and enduring, forcing Meghan, Harry, and even their critics to confront hard truths about modern celebrity and the cost of chasing relevance. The first and most glaring lesson was the fragility of public image. Meghan had invested years in building a narrative of resilience, empowerment, and reinvention. She presented herself as a modern woman who had broken free from the confines of monarchy to carve out her own destiny. Yet one joke, lasting mere seconds, unraveled that image in the eyes of millions. It proved that no matter how carefully one crafts a brand, it is vulnerable to forces beyond control. In the age of viral media, perception can shift overnight, and the work of years can be undone by the laughter of strangers. Another lesson was the unforgiving nature of Hollywood. Meghan had once believed that her royal title and global notoriety would ensure her a place among the elite. But Hollywood is not impressed by titles, it is impressed by results. The lukewarm reception of her projects, combined with industry whispers about her difficulty as a collaborator, made her vulnerable. Greg's joke worked not because it invented something untrue, but because it tapped into an existing perception. Hollywood had not embraced her as she had hoped, and the joke crystallized that reality for the world to see. The lesson was harsh. Ambition alone does not guarantee acceptance, and fame built on controversy is fragile currency. The moment also revealed the power of comedy as cultural critique. Meghan had faced criticism from tabloids, commentators, and even members of the royal family, but it was satire that cut the deepest. Comedy strips away pretense and delivers truths in ways people can instantly grasp. The lesson here was that ridicule often carries more weight than reasoned critique. People may debate an article, argue with an opinion piece, or dismiss a royal statement, but they rarely forget a joke that made them laugh. Meghan learned that being the subject of humor is often more damaging than being the subject of criticism. There was also the lesson of silence. Meghan chose not to respond publicly to the joke, perhaps believing that ignoring it would starve it of oxygen. But silence is not always strength. In this case, her lack of response allowed others to control the narrative. The clips circulated endlessly without challenge, reinforcing the idea that Greg's words had struck a nerve. The lesson was clear. In the modern media environment, silence can sometimes amplify rather than diminish a story. To leave ridicule unanswered is to risk letting it become the accepted truth. For Harry, the lesson was about the limits of protection. He had sacrificed everything, family, tradition, duty, to stand by Meghan and support her ambitions. Yet even he could not shield her from mockery. The joke showed him that love and loyalty are not always enough to protect someone from the harsh realities of fame. It forced him to confront the painful truth that some battles cannot be won, no matter how fiercely fought. For Harry, the humiliation was a reminder that his escape from the monarchy had not freed him from scrutiny. It had only changed its form. The broader lesson for both Meghan and Harry was about the danger of trying to live in two worlds. By leaving the monarchy but continuing to trade on their titles and fame, they created expectations that were impossible to satisfy. They were no longer royals bound by duty, yet they were not fully celebrities embraced by Hollywood either. Greg's joke exposed this limbo. Meghan was mocked not just as a failed actress, but as someone caught between identities, unable to fully succeed in either. The lesson was that trying to straddle two worlds often leaves one stranded in both. For the public, too, the moment carried lessons. It revealed how quick people are to laugh at failure, how easily ambition can be recast as desperation. The joke resonated because it allowed audiences to feel superior to someone who had once seemed untouchable. In laughing at Meghan, people were laughing at the hubris of chasing too much, of believing fame could guarantee fulfillment. The lesson for society was about the thin line between admiration and ridicule, and how quickly admiration can sour when expectations are not met. Yet within the humiliation was also a lesson in resilience. Meghan did not disappear. She continued to appear at events, continued to work on projects, continued to push her narrative of empowerment. For her supporters, this persistence was admirable. It showed that while ridicule can wound, it does not have to destroy. The lesson was that humiliation, however painful, is not the end unless one allows it to be. Meghan's fight to reclaim her image, though fraught with challenges, demonstrated the possibility of enduring even when laughter seems overwhelming. Ultimately, the lessons from the humiliation pointed to a single truth. Fame is both a gift and a trap. It offers opportunity, visibility, and influence, but it also exposes one to ridicule, scrutiny, and failure on a scale few can endure. Meghan entered Hollywood believing she could control fame, harness it to serve her ambitions. Greg's joke proved otherwise. Fame is unpredictable, and those who chase it must be prepared not only for applause, but also for laughter. For Meghan, the humiliation may never fully fade. It will remain a part of her story, replayed in clips and remembered in headlines. But the lessons she takes from it will shape how she moves forward. Whether she learns to adapt, to rebuild, or to retreat remains to be seen. What is certain is that the world will be watching, waiting to see if she can turn ridicule into redemption, or if the laughter will be the final word. When the dust of humiliation begins to settle, when the headlines lose their immediacy, and when the frenzy of online chatter eventually shifts to another target, the hardest question remains: what next? For Meghan Markle, Greg Gutfeld's joke was not just a fleeting sting but a cultural marker, one that cast a long shadow over her ambitions and reputation. If the joke revealed the fragility of her Hollywood dream, then the path forward depends on whether she can redefine herself once again. This is not unfamiliar ground for Meghan. Her life has been one long cycle of reinvention, of climbing from one rung of the ladder to the next, of refusing to stay where others expected her to remain. Yet the stakes now are higher than ever, and the options narrower. One possible path is retreat. Meghan could choose to step back from the limelight, reduce her exposure, and focus on private life. For many celebrities, retreat can sometimes soften public hostility, allowing time to rebuild in a quieter space. Meghan could dedicate herself to philanthropy away from cameras, anchor herself in family life, and gradually rebuild credibility through consistent, quiet work. But retreat is difficult for someone who has tasted the power of visibility. For Meghan, who thrives on public recognition and has built her identity around being seen and heard, retreat would feel less like strategy and more like defeat. Another path is reinvention. Meghan has reinvented herself before. From struggling actress to cable television star, from TV star to duchess, from duchess to cultural figure. She could attempt to pivot again, perhaps by embracing roles that are less about Hollywood stardom and more about global advocacy. If she were to fully commit to causes she champions, education, women's rights, mental health, she might shift perception from celebrity to activist. This would require consistency, humility, and the ability to let the work speak louder than the image. But reinvention of this kind takes time and sacrifice, and the question remains whether Meghan is willing to let go of the Hollywood dream that has defined so much of her ambition. There is also the possibility of doubling down. Meghan could decide that the only way forward is through, not around. She could continue pitching projects, pushing her creative ventures, and fighting to secure her place in Hollywood despite ridicule. This would be the riskiest path because it plays directly against the perception created by Greg's joke. To succeed here, Meghan would need a breakthrough project, a hit so undeniable that it silences the critics and reclaims the narrative. Hollywood loves a comeback, but it only rewards them when the return is backed by substance. Meghan would need to deliver something extraordinary, and so far, her track record has not suggested she has that in her arsenal. Harry's role in this future cannot be ignored. His loyalty to Meghan has defined his public identity since their marriage, and his reputation is tethered to hers. Where Meghan goes from here will shape Harry's future too. If she retreats, he retreats with her. If she reinvents, he will stand beside her as the supportive partner. If she doubles down, he risks being drawn deeper into battles he never truly sought. For Harry, the question is whether his devotion to Meghan will continue to come at the cost of his own public image or whether they can find a way to rebuild together. The royal family's position will also influence Meghan's path. Their silence after her humiliation was telling. They did not need to gloat openly. The world did it for them. But their continued stability, contrasted with Meghan's struggles, highlights the choice she made in walking away. If Meghan attempts to return to royal circles, even symbolically, she would face resistance and perhaps rejection. Yet if she tries to distance herself further, she risks losing the connection that still makes her interesting to many audiences. Her identity is tied to the monarchy, whether she likes it or not, and navigating that connection will be central to her next steps. Public perception is perhaps the greatest obstacle. Once someone becomes a cultural punchline, it is extraordinarily difficult to shed that label. Meghan's challenge will be to find a way to change the story people tell about her. She cannot erase the joke, but she can attempt to create new moments that overshadow it. This might mean stepping outside her comfort zone, taking risks she has previously avoided, or allowing herself to be vulnerable in ways she has resisted. The public responds to authenticity, and Meghan's critics often accuse her of lacking it. If she can find a way to connect genuinely with audiences, she may yet shift the narrative. But the hardest path for Meghan may also be the most necessary: acceptance. Acceptance that Hollywood may never embrace her as she once hoped. Acceptance that fame is not always validation. Acceptance that her story will always be colored by both triumph and ridicule. If she can accept these truths, she may find freedom in them. She may stop chasing the impossible and instead build something sustainable, even if smaller than what she once dreamed. For Meghan, who has always aimed high, acceptance may feel like surrender, but it could also be the key to peace. Where Meghan goes from here will define not just her legacy, but also her marriage, her family, and the future of the Sussex brand. She has been many things to many people: actress, duchess, rebel, victim, opportunist, mother, humanitarian. Each identity has brought both admiration and criticism. Now she stands at another crossroads, one where the path forward is uncertain and the laughter of Greg's joke still echoes. Whether she chooses retreat, reinvention, doubling down, or acceptance, the world will be watching. The lesson of the past years is that Meghan's story is never static. Just when critics declare her finished, she finds a way to return. Just when supporters believe she has triumphed, new controversies pull her down. Where she goes from here will depend not only on her choices, but on her ability to endure the relentless cycle of public opinion. For Meghan Markle, the future remains unwritten, but it will be shaped by one undeniable truth. The world will never stop watching, judging, and laughing, or applauding, depending on what she does next. The story of Meghan Markle's clash with Greg Gutfeld's sharp wit is more than a tale of one humiliating punchline on live television. It is a mirror reflecting the complicated interplay between fame, ambition, and the unforgiving judgment of the public. From the beginning of this saga, Meghan's journey has been defined by her relentless pursuit of recognition, her refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her, and her belief that she could transcend boundaries, first in Hollywood, then in the monarchy, and again in the entertainment world. But the laughter that echoed from a late-night audience stripped all of that away, reducing years of ambition into a single moment of mockery. The humiliation carried with it a brutal irony. Meghan had left the royal family in part to gain independence, to escape the suffocating grip of tradition and the relentless attacks of the British press. She sought freedom in America, the land of opportunity, where she believed she could reshape her image on her own terms. Yet it was here, on American soil, in front of an American audience, that she faced one of her most devastating public humiliations. This irony was not lost on her critics, who saw it as poetic justice, nor on her supporters, who mourned the cruelty of it all. The conclusion to this story is not a clean one, because Meghan's journey is far from over. If anything, Greg's joke was less an ending than a turning point. It forced Meghan and Harry to confront the reality of their position, adored by some, despised by others, mocked by many, and judged by all. It highlighted the limits of their influence, reminding them that no matter how carefully they try to manage their story, there will always be forces outside their control. The monarchy, the media, Hollywood, comedy, all of these forces intersected in that moment, converging to create a storm of laughter and ridicule. But within the humiliation lies the potential for reinvention. Meghan has always been a figure who thrives on resilience. Every setback in her life has been met with a new chapter, a new identity, a new attempt to rise above the noise. This moment, painful as it was, may yet become another opportunity for her to reframe herself. If she chooses humility, authenticity, and substance, she might carve out a path forward that transcends the ridicule. If she continues to chase Hollywood dreams without delivering results, however, the laughter will follow her, growing louder with each stumble. For Harry, the conclusion is equally complex. His role as Meghan's protector is both his greatest strength and his greatest burden. He cannot shield her from ridicule, nor can he undo the choices they have made together. His dilemma is ongoing: to support Meghan at any cost, even when that cost is his own reputation and peace of mind. For him, the laughter was a reminder that love alone cannot silence the world. The monarchy he left behind continues to thrive without him, while he and Meghan wrestle with the volatility of a fame built on rebellion rather than duty. The royal family, in their silence, emerged vindicated in the eyes of many. They did not need to respond to the frenzy because the world had delivered its judgment for them. Their quiet smiles, their composure, contrasted sharply with Meghan's visible struggle, reinforcing the perception that tradition endures while rebellion falters. Whether fair or not, that perception only strengthened the institution Meghan had sought to escape. The public, too, played its role in shaping the conclusion. Their laughter, their debates, their memes, and their divided opinions turned a single joke into a cultural event. Meghan's story has always been about more than her own choices. It has been about what people choose to believe about her. To some, She is a symbol of courage, a woman standing against outdated institutions. To others, she is a symbol of entitlement, chasing fame without earning it. Greg's joke did not create those narratives. It amplified them, forcing people to take sides once again. So where does this story end? Perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps the true conclusion is that Meghan Markle has become one of the most polarizing figures of her generation, someone whose every move sparks fascination, admiration, or ridicule. The laughter from Greg Gutfeld's studio audience may fade in time, but its echo will remain, a reminder of how quickly ambition can turn into mockery. It will follow Meghan as she seeks her next role, her next project, her next reinvention. Whether she succeeds in overcoming it or remains defined by it will depend not only on her choices, but on the willingness of the public to see her differently. For now, the conclusion is bittersweet. Meghan's dreams of Hollywood stardom remain unfulfilled, overshadowed by ridicule. Yet her determination remains, unbroken by the storm. Greg's joke was a moment of triumph for comedy, a cultural verdict on her struggles, but it was not the final word. Meghan's story is still unfolding, still unpredictable, still filled with possibilities for redemption or further decline. And for the audience watching, the takeaway is as clear as it is uncomfortable. Fame is a double-edged sword. It can elevate, inspire, and empower, but it can also humiliate, reduce, and destroy. Meghan Markle chose the path of fame, and with it came both crowns and punchlines. The world will continue to watch her journey, not because she is perfect or flawless, but because she embodies the contradictions of ambition itself, the desire to be seen, the fear of irrelevance, and the relentless fight to matter in a world that is always ready to laugh.